to order. It's been a long time since we've been to a work session. It has flag salute on there, so we will follow the agenda. So as you all rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. And Mike, you're hiding over there in the corner. You can start us off, please.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thanks, everyone. All right. So first item on the agenda is public comment. So this would be the time that if there's someone in the audience who would like to come forth and make a comment, this would be the time. That doesn't mean you're going to be limited in work sessions. It's a little bit more flexible. And if you got a comment through the items that were on the agenda, feel free to discuss them. If you need a copy, do we have copies somewhere, Roger, of the agenda if someone needs one?
I'm not sure if they're.
We'll get you one.
They're on the table.
Yeah, if someone need. Okay, they're on the table. All right. Any public comments? All right. Hearing none. Number A. No, we're going to do 3, right? No, the library, the CARES Act. So who's Sammy's on the screen? I see. So Sammy.
Yes.
I see
Good
that you got a
evening.
grant that you want us to accept. I don't know why we would do that, but you go ahead.
So the library did receive the state library received some money and is passed through as a grant to our library for the amount of $13,043. The purpose of the grant was you could choose from several, mostly technology related things, and the library has chosen to get laptops and hotspots for patrons to check out, since we have fewer hours they can use our public computers and fewer computers that we can use due to social distancing. So if it pleases, or I guess you don't make any decisions tonight, but at the next meeting, if you would consider it for approval of acceptance.
So do we know how many laptops and hotspots this is anticipated to cover?
At this point, we're ordering 10 to begin with, because we also have to not only the price of that, but the cases and some software to go on it. So there's going to be some additional expenses to make, to have them up and running. So we're starting with 10, and then obviously we'll increase should we have the money to do so.
And won't the cost fluctuate depending on the hotspots and how much use on the data?
We have. It will, yes, and that's part of the thing is we have to set the hotspots up to a consistent data point and have some software to monitor those. So there's some of those other expenses will be part of the grant.
I don't know, Roger. And I'm not sure if you're aware of it, Sammy, but we also had a discussion with DFN about getting some hotspots and some frequency available to the schools and different things throughout the county. Kyle Stevens, through SOWEB, had kind of taken the lead on that. Have we contacted them, and maybe we can get some free data for the hotspots? I'm not sure if that would be available to them or not, but it might be something to think about. If you need
Certainly worth checking, yes.
Yeah, you can contact Kyle if you need the contact information. Roger and myself both have it.
Okay, great.
Questions? Anyone else? Comments?
Good job.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
Yeah, I was pleased to get the news.
Yeah.
Sammy, when do you think these will be available?
The laptops have been ordered. That was kind of a challenge in and of itself, because our first plan kind of fell through. Laptops are kind of like the toilet paper of right now, very hard to get a hold of. So we did manage to get 10 ordered though, and so they should be in within 2 weeks or so.
Great. Anyone else? All right. Update on Public Works Streets and Parks projects. Randy, I see you're here, so we have Jim. You're going to be here handling that, right?
Yes, Randy's got it.
Good to see you. How have you been?
Yeah, it's been a few days, huh?
Yeah.
Well, come tonight to give you an update on a few projects that we got going throughout the city. East Side Safe Routes to School project has been going along really, really well. We're able to get all the storm functions done to that project, all the way from this new bridge up to F Street. And that traffic control that you currently see now will switch. They will take it up to F Street and divert it up 9th. And then that'll go for about a week and a half until they get the last section of sidewalk put in that block. Then they'll close that traffic control out, and then we'll focus up on D Street. going down to the school. And that's
So
last
isn't
night.
it Ninth also someone, is that the one
Bill
that's,
said that, I thought.
is Ninth going to be
Yeah,
addressed?
from,
That's actually from F up to
Coos
D
River
Street
Highway.
would get done in spring of next year, yes. it will.
okay, 'cause that street's been beat up pretty hard. I noticed that you patched a bunch of stuff
Knife River did, yes,
a couple of weeks ago
yes.
up there, and I thought, okay, well, that's just a temporary stopgap until they finish.
That's correct.
Because that street, to me, it looks like it's gonna need a full
It
revamp.
is on the list, and we knew that when we come into the project, so that's why we didn't do it this year, so we wanted to save that to the
Gotcha.
spring.
So
Yeah,
Randy,
there-
I'm sorry, is it spring of next year that
Yes,
will be done?
that one's
Okay,
on there.
thank you.
Perfect.
So then Brock will continue sidewalk the rest of the way on that corridor on D Street up to the school, and that project will be closed out. The date on that is the end of December, we have to be done. So they're right on target.
Okay.
And then on Fourth Street, we just had a utility meeting today again out there because we've been having problems with all of our utility providers out there. But we worked that out today, and so now they're back on point and got a game plan going forward. That project is really moving forward quickly. The water board got their utilities in, and they're out of the way, so now they're doing stub outs for their meters. And then we will be doing curb and gutter probably starting next week. The contractor arrived today, so they'll be mobilizing out there to do curb and gutter. We've got some tie-ins in different locations at different businesses along the way, but that's minor elevations that we'll work out in the process. So that project is on schedule and moving forward remarkably well, given all the utilities in that corridor.
Yeah.
Give you a little update on Amorisco. So we've done that audit. We're almost through the data collecting process, and there's going to be a lot of good information come from that. We'll share at another meeting. But I just wanted to let you know that we're on key with it.
And for clarification, that is the street lamp project.
And then Mingus Park Design, I set on your table there in a schedule. It's a aggressive schedule, but very doable in terms of meeting the deadlines for the grant. Now, I have learned today, obviously, given the lottery issues and the state funding issues statewide, but they're not closing off the grants. They're accepting them. So we're going to move through like we know what we're doing, and we're going to get the funds. State says submit them anyway. So they'll build up lists and qualify those projects and then issue that award, but you may not get the funding right now until the state determines what that process is in dollars, what city and what grants get what. Once we know that, then we can revisit the schedule and get more fine-tuned. That'll probably happen in February, March, by the time we find out what the funding looks like. I've talked with Mark from the Oregon Parks and Rec. He's the one that administers the LGG program, and he has told me that probably December, he'll be able to let me know exactly where we're landing.
So, so to refresh everyone's memory, that's going to be to dredge the pond, correct? And there's going to be a fishing pier or
Yes,
dock or?
there's actually two phases, Mayor, to this. So there's dredging the pond and building the fishing piers around the lake. And then the material coming out of the dredge will be used to backfill the south end of the park because we got really low elevations. So the design before you is raising that back into the park about 3 feet, 2.5 to 3 feet. New sidewalks, new restrooms, pavilions, new playgrounds.
Oh, a new playground too?
Yes,
That was
So,
my question, was the restrooms.
so if I remember correctly, this was $1 million grant?
actually, I'm going to give some estimates here. I call them estimates. I want to use the tongue loosely because they haven't been built yet. But I'm going to say the development portion of it, which is rehabilitation of the park, is probably $1 million, the dredging is probably about $725,000 by the time we finish the dredging and we put the fishing piers and the ADA ramps in. So total, roughly about 1.7, 1.8.
Is there any percentage that we're paying on this?
I'm going to actually double that up, the ODF grant that we're submitting for. We also have some in-kind donations here locally that was made to the project, so we're going to use that as the match. And then take ODFW and match that to the OPRD grant.
Great. And it's going to be dredged down to 10 feet, am I correct?
That's correct.
Saying right now, and before it's been like 4?
Yeah, originally we started with 4 feet, but we had a meeting in probably December with ODFW. They requested to go deeper. They said, we'll pay. I said, we'll go deeper.
Well, so that'll be better for, and they're going to stock it with fish, correct?
That's correct.
And so that'll be better for the fish?
It's gonna be of various types of fishes is what I understand, so not just one species.
Right? All right, thank
So
you.
there's minimal cost to the city then? This is?
Very minimal.
Okay.
And the depth will help with the vegetation growth and all that stuff that we
That's
have going
correct.
on in
We're
the area.
working with the Coos watershed right now even on some vegetation management in the park and invasive species removal in the park as well. There will be some serious vegetation removal once we actually start dredging that. Before we dredge it, they'll actually contain those invasive species and move them out of there, then we'll dredge it, so we don't transfer them.
You know, Randy, we used to have those aerators in there, and they were supposed to help with the vegetation, plus it was kind of aesthetically nice. Is that something that's going to happen or not happen?
I don't recommend the type that was in there. Those units cost $7,500 every time they go bad.
Okay,
So we're putting a main line in the bottom of the pond, if you will, and it'll have spigots that pop up. They'll be your aerators, they do the same thing.
Oh.
You'll have a pump on shore, so you don't have to go in the water and change it.
but there'll be some type of something like that.
Yeah, you'll have an aerator separator in there.
Perfect.
And as far as the asphalt projects go, we've had a very busy year there. Quite a few of these projects we've gotten done through the tough, and we still have a few left. Just to touch bases on those, it's 8th and Ferguson. That's underway right now. I think they're about ready to wrap up on Donnelly. And so Donnelly's underway. It's the other half of Donnelly because we did the other half last year. And then 5th Street, it's also underway right now. There's a section that's bad. It's about 10 by probably a 20-foot section. We're taking that out and building the road bed up. So anytime we go in there and we're going to correct these bad issues, we want to make sure we got a good road bed in there so we don't have to come back through and tear that section out. So they're taking care of that. And then on 1st Street, between Star of Hope, it happened that we just landed on a really good deal here. Star of Hope was doing their parking lot and wanting to enhance. So while we were there, I said, let's talk about 1st Street because it is on our list.
Right?
You know, so while you're here, you're mobilizing for them, what are we going to do over there? So we got a really good deal on that. So we're going to do 1st Street down up to the gravel where it shifts to gravel there because we do have infrastructure.
Right. Yeah, it definitely needs it.
Yeah, it'll look good. So that's what I got for you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Question for Andy?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
that's great.
A lot of work, a lot of straight work, and so finish up this year and then start up next year, right?
Yeah, can't wait.
All right.
Mr. Mayor,
Randy,
the
I have a
project-
question. You said 4th Street's on schedule. What is that schedule?
4th Street is basically being right now, they start the curb and gutter here within the next probably week here. Contractor's just here. They'll jump. So if you're talking about timeline from when the project will be completed, we're anticipating about midsummer next year by the time that trigger ends.
They are doing both sides of the street, right? On the
That's correct.
sidewalks?
Yeah, what they'll do now is get the curb and gutter in, and they'll grade that out with gravel base, not touch the road yet, jump on the other side, and get all your concrete sidewalks all the way back up to 4th and Anderson, and then gravel that out, then do that next block in between the mid block
Gotcha.
and each side of it. Any other questions?
Anyone else? Oh, Roger?
I was going to share that when the Urban Renewal Agency went out and instituted the special levy, and then later the agency went out for funding for the 4th Street project, we went out for a certain amount. The 4th Street project came in under the amount, and we began thinking about where else could we do some street improvements. Originally, we were looking at Curtis, and we were heading down that path until it was realized that we still have the large, I'll call it a viaduct, it's not a viaduct, but it's the large duct that comes all the way down from Mingus, all the way out, and it's large enough that you can actually walk in it, although I wouldn't advise it during the wintertime, because it's a large full of water. But that, it's been in there a long time, and it's going to need some work on it to reseal all the joints. And I think wisely, Randy and Jim have suggested that we don't do Curtis yet. We wait till we get that project done first, because our worst case would be that there's a section of that pipe that needs to be replaced. And I think it's 6 by 10 feet.
The vault sections are 6 by 7.
So where does that run from? It's Mingus Park to, and how does it?
It actually comes from Mingus and turns down 9, it goes down 9 and cuts through the apartments right there. and T's in 7th, right at Bennett there. And as you come to the east, it goes right in front of Mark Daly's building, cuts over again on 4th, and down Curtis.
You know, I know maybe it's bringing this up now, but Carmen Brett mentioned one time before, if you know, for something that's different, is there any way that we can have part of that open for visibility for,
You mean inspection?
well, yeah, not just that, but I mean visibility for an attraction type thing, you know?
Daylighting the creek.
Because I don't think people realize, it's there, and, I mean, is there any way that we can make it, I don't know if it's possible or not, but it's something that was brought up by Carmen at one time.
Well, I think you'd need to do quite a bit of engineering, but I'm not going to say everything's possible at all. Anything's possible.
Everything's possible, it's just how much do you want
All
to
right,
spend on
well, we
it?
put a bug in your ear, and if we can tie in some kind of grant with ODF and Debbie and run the fish through there back out to Bay or something, right?
Now, from what I understood, was it Bennett that a section of that street was actually shut down at one point? And
Bennett has been vacated, a section of Bennett right by the library.
exactly. I was thinking that, during the time of when we have to deconstruct the library at some point in the future, that you have that large parking area, it could be turned into a urban green space if it was a daylighted creek that had, parking or something nearby, since that vault runs right next to the library.
Sure.
That's what I was kind of thinking. I mean, you and I have talked many times about the vault that's in front of my warehouse there, and that project's coming up as well. It'll be interesting to see the status of that vault when we open up the road right there.
I think there'll actually be an opportunity when we get to the Curtis and 4th Street intersection, because that viaduct does go, it goes down the center of it and turns and does a 90 there in the middle of 4th. So we will probably be at a location when we dig out the road bed, and we're regrading that road bed to be able to look at that section. But to be honest with you, I've walked that maybe 9-8 years ago, and it's like walking in a jungle. Machetes, you got to cut all the roots out, and when there's grout that's blown into the seams where your vaults come together, and the grout has loosened up in places and where there's none, and roots have penetrated those areas. So hydraulic suctioning is something where a tide table works in and out, and when it blows out the vault, it can also pull out groundwater and ground soils. So,
Right.
anything else?
Thanks. Always, and thank you very much. Good job on all that stuff. Discussion of possibly, anyone else? Building codes, regulations and additions. So Jim, you're handling this? You
Yes,
got
sir.
Mike on the sidelines for this or what?
Mike's on the sidelines. He can answer the technical questions for you if you have any.
Okay.
But the state is the one that has the building codes for the state of Oregon. They're overseen by the State Building Codes Division, or BCD. And they have, from time to time, reinterpreted their authority to implement the building code. And they've come to the point now that statewide codes only apply to buildings or structures used primarily by human occupants. So in their 2019 update of the building code, they articulated 26 specific items that they no longer regulate. And of those 26, they'll allow local municipalities to implement up to 20 of those. Now, we already have in our code, Chapter 15 and others, codes that oversee abatement of nuisances, demolition, temporary use of our right-of-way, encroachments into the right-of-way, and floodplain. And now, there are 5 others that we're recommending council consider. Staff bring to you regulations to consider for adoption. And those have to do with retaining walls, fences, tanks, communication towers, and signage. And we just want to answer any questions you might have about our request and go on from there.
Well, the only thing is, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this thing, but there was an item that I mentioned on mine. I got too much stuff here. One moment.
I got one in the weeds if you want me to buy some time.
Well, I don't go ahead if you want.
Sure. Not directly related to anything we're talking about doing here as far as codes, but related to nuisance abatement observation I had the other day is there's quite a few businesses in the area here in Coos Bay and in North Bend that have been putting up chipboard in the windows, and something maybe to put to yourself or to put to the rest of the council, if we might not want to look at something that if there's going to be chipboard in a window, have it rattle canned to somewhat match the color of the building, not just be plain chipboard in the window. Or if that's not something we could even execute through the urban renewal funds, because spray paint doesn't cost much. But it's a visual aspect that I think would be beneficial to some of our areas where we're seeing chipboard go up in doors and windows.
Does that fall under here?
It does or doesn't, but I would say that we could not use urban renewal funds for that. Urban renewal funds has to be for capital improvements. And, it'd take a lot of spray paint to get to a capital improvement.
True.
But to Drew's point, can we require it?
That's something I think we can look into and talk about. I will say that in North Bend, when they shuttered the house at Sherman and Newmark, their code enforcement went in, I believe that was their fire department. They went in and painted all the boards the same color as the house. And it did make it look nice as it could.
Right.
Of course, that whole project's been mitigated now and completely redone, looks great.
Looks great.
But it does have a nice appeal to it. It's something that will have to be talked about, and we can bring back some thoughts for you.
Okay.
It was just something that came to mind when I saw the Sizzler over in North Bend right now has the board up, and then we've got Fast Mart down at the McKay's over that way that's got some chipboard up. So.
Well, and I've noticed that they're using plywood too. If they're using a window, something that used to be a window, they're putting plywood up in the window, so it looks like it's boarded up, but it's still a functioning business.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
aesthetically, on the inside, it doesn't look bad, but on the outside, maybe.
So something that's not being addressed on that is transitional housing accommodations. That's not, that was on the state items, but it's not on this, anything that we're doing. Is that something that we need to think about with the housing issues going on and stuff, or not? It's number 23 on the scope of administration from the state, I guess.
Yeah, and it's number 19 of those that we can adopt. And I think Mike can speak to this probably.
I mean, if we
Because
don't,
I think
if
we
nothing,
already,
I guess if we don't adopt something and it's not on our, that we do, then what happens to it? It just is in limbo or what?
I believe under building codes, if you don't adopt something, then it's not inspected through your
Right.
building codes. Doesn't mean that it can't happen, it's just not an inspection through building codes.
Okay, all right. I just was concerned what happened with the transitional housing accommodations. I mean, is it just,
oh, okay.
I mean, it's something that we're going to be dealing with, right? I mean, it's an
Right.
issue that's been before us here. And so I just didn't know where it would fall under this. Do we still put it somewhere else, or?
Well, we currently use Mike's department, and primarily Mike, and the fire chief when we're looking at temporary lodging or even like the warming center to go make sure that we have proper life safety. And I think that's really the issue
Okay.
that we'll need to address.
So,
It's
Mike,
generally not structural.
yeah, that's right. Mike, does this be like tents or yurts, things of that nature?
First of all, good evening,
Hey, Mike.
Honorable Council. And what was the question? About yurts and tents?
No, it's about transitional housing. That wasn't one of the items that we recommend.
No, that's not one. Actually, what we want to do on the transitional housing accommodations is talk with Carolyn as far as, because the state is going through a lot of changes right now, especially with the transitional housing. And we're not sure which direction they're going, but we're going to, it's kind
So
of a
this is one we'll
planning
bring to
issue.
the council in the future if there's some significant changes. And we can do it now. We can incorporate it into what we're doing for you in this iteration and for your consideration.
It's, why this was, I didn't know what would happen to it. I mean, under the scenario, does it just, you know, is it in limbo? Or is there still gonna be some oversight, or what would happen? And so, I mean, it's something that we're gonna be dealing with, and so I didn't know, you know, what was gonna happen with it.
We're not real sure of it either until they make a decision on the transitional housing, where it can be, you know, the zoning, certain zoning areas prohibit it. Other zonings will embrace it, if you will. But the transitional housing wasn't one of them that we looked at as needing to be brought back into the code at this time.
Okay.
It's not a high priority at this time, because like Roger was saying, we still have our short-term emergency lodging and such that the fire chief and myself, we go inspect those to make sure that they're safe and
Okay.
all the accommodations are there.
As long as everyone's satisfied with it, I think at some point, we're gonna have to be addressing it in some fashion, I would think.
Could I get a quick definition, how they're defining transitional housing, if they're referring to that as transitioning from being homeless, or if that's transitioning out of mental health services or addiction?
That's a good question, because the transitional housing, from what I understand, encompasses quite a bit of variation. Because it could be from anything from homelessness to joblessness. You may still have a home, but you've got a family, you've got to transition back into the
Okay.
mainstream. Or it
Incarceration.
could be felons.
Well, I was curious because I remember at one point, working with mental health, they had a question about codes, and I had to look at it and ask city staff, of course, because I always lean on city staff for answers. And there was, I remember there being a piece of code that addressed transitional housing with regards to mental health, at least, where as long as there weren't more than 4 individuals being housed at the facility, it was okay, you know, I think in any residential or commercial zone. So I think we already have something on the books for that.
Yes, I believe we do.
Okay, I think that we need to keep it on the radar at whatever time that we need to bring it back, Jim and Mike, whoever's involved, and then, you know, we can keep addressing it.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Bob, you had some comments on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say, that my experience with transitional housing is that we're really looking at a situation here in southern Oregon where, from Eugene down to the border, we're looking at the loss of probably 4,000 units of housing. And as these folks are trying to get back on their feet, a temporary shelter isn't going to do it for them. They need something longer term while they're rebuilding. That's where transitional housing could come in. I don't know what the bureaucratic process is that you guys are dealing with, but certainly it is something I would urge you to keep an eye on and keep your options open, because I think you're going to need it.
Okay.
And I will say, just for the record, I have a transitional house on my block. It's invisible. People don't even know it's there. It seems to be working just fine. We haven't had any problems with it. I think that people maybe have a misconception that transitional housing automatically means you're putting in recovering alcoholics or people with mental health problems, and that it creates problems for the neighborhood. But I think we're going to see something else here that really is talking about families.
Thanks, Bob. Anyone else on these issues for consideration of building codes? Nope? Thanks, Mike. Good seeing you. All right. If council doesn't mind, we're going to move up to public hearing to consider proposal, we're not going to have a public hearing, but the discussion on solid waste franchise rate adjustment. Bill has a meeting to go at 7 o'clock, and so we don't want to definitely prolong, we don't want to cause him not to attend that meeting. So is everyone all right with that? Let's move it up. So Bill, come on up, and I see that there's going to be a rate adjustment proposed. That is something that is normal every year?
It is, it's actually, we're asking for 75% of 2019 CPI. It was 2.5%, we're asking for 1.9, which breaks down to 43 cents a month for a 35-gallon can, and $55 per cubic yard for the commercial containers.
Okay, so I mean, this is pretty standard throughout the following years, if I remember correctly. Is it usually right around this, or is it a little bit more or less?
No, it's usually real close to this. Like I say, 2.5 and 3% is pretty normal over the last few years. And like I say, we're trying to, ease the paying a little bit of the CPI by going 75%, to live within our means, basically, and not ask for too much, and stay priced with, on the low end of price of every other company, of equal size pretty much around the state. I know that Roger's done a lot of homework over the years, getting pricing from other areas to make sure that we're, staying within the guidelines, so.
I'll have to confess, that's not me, that's the finance department.
Oh, okay,
But,
sorry.
But if you look in here, there are some comparisons, so.
There is, and as
Yeah.
far as last year, I believe last year's increase was slightly higher. I think it was 51 cents.
So just for clarification, Bill, this is not to bring you more profit, is it? Or is it just to kind of cover the cost?
Well, of course, we're gonna probably make a little bit more money off of it, but also, we've bought $500,000 worth of equipment over the last 3 years. And, upgrading, buying new carts, new containers, new everything, so, and actually giving, CPI increases to our employees, and, the cost of medical benefits and all that just keeps going up, so that's why.
Okay.
But this is low when we compare it to Newport, which is $34, or Florence, which is $27, in comparison.
And Bill, can you talk about how our rate includes the recycling versus some of the communities that are smaller?
Yeah, actually, the pricing, a lot of it's so hard to compare, apples to apples, because a lot of the smaller communities under 4,000 don't have recycling service mandated. And we actually have been recycling since 1992, and we got approval from DEQ in 1992 to charge $2.50. So that $2.50 is actually included in the rates to this day. So really, if you back that out, then, we're still under $20, pretty close.
And aren't we one of the few areas, well, not maybe one of the few, but there are some areas that are not recycling at all, am I correct?
Yeah, there's a lot of them, that because the pricing on the recycling is actually negative, we're paying $50 a ton to take it to a recycling center that actually sorts it. So it's negative $50 a ton for us, plus the cost of picking it up and stuff, so.
Sure.
But we always try to stay, ahead of the game. We want to make sure that we ensure recycling into the future. We've had to cut back on a couple of different items on it, different types of plastic, because there is no market for it, because of the Chinese are actually buying pretty much everything. But it's kind of stratifying into different areas and local and regional, markets now. So it's actually doing a lot better. And, and like I say, we're going to hold our own until we, hopefully never run out of a market. But the other thing too is that with these markets, we've been taking our material to the same place for 20 years. And if you run around trying to find price on this stuff, you get out of that line, basically, if there is a problem, they won't take your material because that's, you know, because you've decided to go for the money instead of the, you know, the tonnage. And so we've been really faithful to the people, and they've been really good to us. Even when the market's like zero or negative, they've still been taking our material, so we've been fortunate that way.
Good.
Do you think that China market will ever come back so that we can recycle more of those plastics?
I think what's gonna happen more than anything is that there's gonna be markets created within the United States. I really do. I think that there's two things that can happen. Either we have to, you know, find a market for this material, or else they're gonna have to quit making it. That's how I see it. And there's just so many different types of plastic, and they're all, you can't mix them together, they just don't work. And, you know, like a television, plastic's completely different than, you know, the plastic of a laptop, or, you know, just, like I say, there's just hundreds of different kinds, and what they've done is they've patented each type of plastic. So it's really, really crazy, the whole thing. But we're doing a lot more electronic waste recycling now than we have been in the past, which is good, because every television has 5 pounds of lead in it. So that's been going on. Everything's kind of going to the flat screens now, and so we're starting to see a little bit of a change there. But you know, every day we get 20 televisions into the recycle center over there. So that's a really good thing. That and computers and, you know, monitors and all that kind of stuff. And that's free, by the way. I don't know if anybody realizes that. We take that material for free because we're part of the electronic waste program, the Oregon Electronic Waste Program. And we actually get a stipend for recycling that material. It's not much. It just pays for the freight, basically, for us to, you know, to get it down to the markets. But it's out of the waste stream, and that's a huge deal. I mean, people don't have any idea how much material that stuff is. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds just from this area. You know, it's crazy. You wouldn't believe it. You know, truckload a month. That's what we do, televisions and electronics.
It is amazing.
Yeah. Good stuff to keep out of the waste stream.
Yes, it is.
So,
Any other questions for Bill? Anyone?
Just before he goes, this doesn't have anything to do with the franchise fee, but did the fires east of us have any impact on where you are having to transport waste from here?
No, not for us, because we take ours to Dry Creek landfill down in Medford, and
Okay,
and Eagle Point was close, but they avoided that area, so that wasn't an impact on us. One of our other companies, Sanapac in Eugene, a lot of the employees, you know, lost homes up the Mackenzie River, so we're all kind of chipping together on that and helping them out. So, but no, we weren't impacted at all by that. Anyway,
Are there going to be increases at the transfer station?
probably in January, about 2% or something like that. We usually normally do that. We kind of see how the county's going with their pricing, because we don't want to overprice with them. So we normally do like I say, a CPI increase yearly.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it may be January or July. I'm not quite sure what we figured out yet. That's about it.
Thanks.
And that's completely separate from the franchise. So.
Yeah, I knew, is it same company or is it a separate company?
So it's the same company, yeah.
Okay, but it's not part of the franchise
No.
agreement? Yeah, that seems to be a busy place.
And we're actually getting ready to do a bunch of asphalt work and spend $1 million on stormwater down there.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's our big project for the end of this year and into next year, is we're gonna be putting a stormwater treatment system in down on the south end of the transfer station.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, so that's Clean Rivers, they're gonna be the ones that are doing it.
All right.
So, and then right now, we're actually seeking bid proposals to do the excavation work, and PBS Engineering's working with the city for permitting right now, I think. I don't know if you guys, they're working on it. So, okay,
Bill, thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Have a good meeting.
Appreciate it.
Yep,
Thank you, Bill.
You bet, we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
yes.
All right, thank you.
Huh?
Bye.
Next item is discussion regarding the 2020 Coos Bay Housing Needs Analysis. Carolyn, are you handling this, or Jim?
Yes, Carolyn's handling it.
Here she is, hiding out.
Hello, everyone. How is everybody this evening? Nice to see you. I want to take you back to earlier this year when you authorized as a council some forward movement on updating the comprehensive go into that, and we've been doing that this year.
Carolyn, you're breaking up.
And has certain requirements.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Carolyn, so
Disabling video will probably fix it.
you want to disable your video, or I can continue?
I think we lost her.
So should we, Jim, you want to continue then?
Yeah, I'll continue on.
Okay.
Actually, I got back in if you can hear me. I just
Okay.
don't think you're going to be able to see me. That's okay.
We can hear you, Carolyn, if you want to start over, please. We didn't respond, so she clicked back out. Jim, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. So, this is something, a journey we started on earlier this year. And Carolyn, do you want to try one more time since you're back? Okay, I'll continue.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, we've lost you. I'll continue on. So the 2020 Coos Bay Housing Needs Analysis identifying current and projected future housing needs to 2040 was recently completed and is attached to your report here. And the key conclusions were sufficient residential, with regard to sufficient residential buildable lands, is that there are 480 developable acres available to accommodate projected housing needs. The needed number of new housing units is 604 new units, 489 for new ownership and 115 for rentals in a variety of price ranges. Renter demand. The greatest renter demand is for the low to moderate income housing. Rental demand is greater than supply at the lowest income level, and that is under $15,000 per year. Ownership demand for middle to upper end homes. The demand is high, with existing lower priced units exceeding and outpacing demand for middle to upper end homes. Home ownership demand in the lowest income range. This demand for ownership housing will be the lowest in the lowest income range. Future demand for rental housing will remain more evenly spread among the lower to middle income ranges. Rental demand will be lowest in the highest income range. Now, Jake Callister of the Lane Lane Council of Governments will provide an overview of the 2020 Housing Needs Analysis for the council.
Can you hear me? This is Jacob Callister. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I'm going to share my screen. We'll hope that that works. Let me know if you can see the screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
City of Coos Bay Housing Needs Analysis?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, excellent. Okay. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, Council. Been working very closely with Carolyn and a housing advisory committee that I'm going to introduce you to here. I've been asked to give just essentially an introduction to the housing needs analysis. And so I've tried to really boil this down. I've been going over these details with the committee and with others in detail. So I've tried to really distill it down to some key points and save some time for questions. But yeah, one of the things that Carolyn wanted to point out, and I'm going to skip ahead to this slide here, is to just give you a sense for who the Housing Advisory Committee is. Carolyn sent me a little text message to say, make sure that the whole council knows that Councilor Kilmer and Councilor Farmer were on that advisory committee, and so they've participated in this process. And so we had a nice cross section of stakeholders who were involved in that. Primarily, sort of a technical advisory committee. It's really what it shaped up to be, and we had some really great engagement, good meetings, and we wanted to provide a quick overview of sort of that process. This was something that we began in spring. I remember one of our first meetings had to kind of be rethought because it was right when things were shutting down, and it was kind of the beginning of how we've been doing these meetings. It's one of the first ones for me, at least, like this. So we had several iterations with that committee. I wanted to just emphasize that there was a lot of iterating, feedback, iteration, getting different perspectives, and kind of going back and reincorporating different elements of feedback. And so you can see on our timeline here, we're here towards the end. This the red squares are things we've done, and the orange square is this meeting, and then there's a hearing planned for next month. And so we're really close to having the analysis ready to support some follow-up steps. The work that we're doing with the housing needs analysis is funded by the Department of Land Conservation and Development. It's one of these instances that we really appreciate when the legislature mandates something, but then also has technical dollars associated with it. Sometimes that doesn't always happen, but in this case, we got funds. The city got funds to undertake some steps in support of House bills related to essentially addressing the state's housing crisis. And the steps that we engaged in as part of this project was an update to housing needs analysis. There's another one that's coming up that will kind of show you how it feeds into an ongoing process, and that is to conduct regional housing needs analyses. All of this is in support of Goal 10 housing and Goal 14 urbanization. So just a little bit of some context for this. We're going to talk about two pieces of this analysis. We call it the housing needs analysis, but it's really built on two pieces. One is the buildable lands analysis, which feeds into the housing needs analysis. And these are really at a relatively, there are definitely variables that have some subjectivity, but it's more or less an objective characterization of the existing setting and an informed forecast and assumption about the future. The regional housing needs analysis will be, I believe, a step closer to sort of policy level things. Policy really lives in the comprehensive plan for the city of Coos Bay, and so both of those documents are, and you may be familiar with the project that's being undertaken now to essentially take the findings and conclusions of those and incorporate them into the comprehensive plan. So policy informs implementation, and so there's also part of the current project to look at how the zoning development code in the city of Coos Bay would be impacted by the policy implications and analysis implications. So that's just context for sort of how this fits into moving forward. What we're bringing here is this first step, trying to sort of get the acceptance of the council and a thumbs up to kind of move forward through our follow-up steps that will really involve more, again, policy development and actual regulation. Both of these analyses intend to create a strong data-driven characterization of current residential land and housing dynamics. So we're looking at supply and demand around housing and land associated with those housing needs. We're looking to make an informed assumption about future land and housing dynamics to contemplate potential needs and to inform decision-making related to those needs. The sources that we use in the project include everything from really objective sources like the U.S. Census Bureau, Census and American Community Survey, GIS data, local and state GIS resources that help us characterize some spatial relationships. Permit data was drawn to help us gather some trend information. The Housing Advisory Committee was a good source for some anecdotal and research data that we gleaned in the process. And then looking at trends. Trends become a really important part for of looking forward. It's really, it's all you have, right, is the historic trends and then certain, behaviors and the trends that are emerging from the research around housing. So I created this little graphic. It's a little bit basic, but I think it helped the Housing Advisory Committee just really quickly capture what we're doing in a buildable lands inventory. This is a really gross characterization of a community. You've got vacant land. That's land that is either just objectively vacant or it has improvements of very low value. You have partially vacant land, which is pieces of large land that's significantly larger than, say, a minimum lot size in a community. Typically, the threshold that's used and what we used in this was anything over an acre within the urban growth boundary. So something that just has objective potential for accommodating future housing, just in the sort of traditional development sense. Redevelopable lands, which have a sort of market incentive for redeveloping. Environmentally constrained lands, which are constrained, so the wetlands and the slopes over a certain amount and certain areas of floodplain are examples of constrained lands where you do not want to. The whole exercise here is to figure out where are we likely to accommodate future population with housing, and so you don't want to accommodate them on high risk lands. Then developed lands, which are ostensibly being used effectively presently. So our real focus is on these here. This is the buildable lands. Just like your paycheck is your gross pay, it's the full amount, but it's not necessarily the money. All of that money isn't something you get to spend. You need to, in the buildable lands inventory sense, we have lands that we need to accommodate public uses and semi-public uses. And then we also have infrastructure that we can account for. And so what we end up with when we account for those is our net buildable acres, just like your net income, right? We subtract it out, what really isn't functionally available, and isolate it down to what really is, what can truly accommodate housing. In BLI, in the buildable lands inventory, we then characterize all that by zones because we want to be able to distinguish between certain zone types. The ultimate goal is to look and see, our housing need in the future. How could it be accommodated? Will we have enough currently? Do we have enough buildable land to accommodate that? And once we've accounted for any sort of future growth, anything that's left over would be our surplus. So what you see here in the blue would be your surplus. It's what you have after you've accounted for growth. This is a tabular representation of what I just showed you. Essentially, these are the numbers. As we ran through the analysis, you'll see Jim mentioned we have the city of Coos Bay has 480 acres of buildable land, accounting for all of these variables. What that 480 acres of land really translates into, when you look at unit per acre projections fairly conservatively, is just under 5,000 housing units. And so it's a fairly considerable amount of buildable land that technically, and based on the fairly conservative inputs of the buildable lands inventory, is available for future growth. This is a map that's generated that's part of the needs analysis that you'll see. These are categories, the categories that we just discussed in the city of Coos Bay, distinguished by those categories. This is another important map that's included in the study, which is the environmental constraints that informed the reduction in buildable land, at least one of those reductions. So you'll see slope in red, and then quite a few things that are associated with the water, whether it be floodplain. Floodplain is not completely a constraint because the development code allows development in the floodplain. There was a proportional constraint applied, which was, okay, some of the areas will probably develop, but we can also assume that some of the areas really will be impractical to develop. So that's kind of the supply side. And characterizing now the need side and how we develop, looking at what sort of the demands are. There's a couple of things that happens here on this piece, and one is to characterize the current housing need, and that has to do with housing stock. So what is the physical housing dynamic in Coos Bay? And then this other layer of, okay, that's the stock, but what about the housing dynamic? What about the needs? And the way we look at that is to take the population of the community with those data sources that we talked about, sometimes a hybrid of sources to try to refine it. We look at the renter-owner split, the age dynamic, the income dynamic of the community, and all of that through the lens of the housing stock itself. And it's really important because we tend to focus on the sort of future element of the housing needs analysis to say, here's what we're going to need going forward, here's what we're going to need in 2040. But another really important piece of this is the current need in Coos Bay. So, how in Coos Bay currently do the demographics, in particular, the sort of age and income and rental components, how do they match up with the housing stock that's available? And are there mismatches? Looking forward to 2040, we're looking at growth, so that's good. Not every community, can actually say that, but Coos Bay is looking at growth, albeit fairly, moderate growth. Those same dynamics and demographics get applied to the future projection. That population forecast is something that's essentially handed to us by the state through the Population Research Center, Portland State. We get those population forecasts that we use. We have our existing housing stock, and then of course we have this future housing stock need. And it's not just a number of units, but it's a number of units at certain types. And so that becomes the kind of key demand piece that emerges from this. And it takes into account current need as well. So you could say in 2020, you could come up with a similar need. Maybe what's happening presently isn't what is perfectly matching the need. Just a high-level summary of just kind of looking at the 2020 to 2040. This table here summarizes a lot of the analysis that's in the document, but it kind of boils it down to what we're looking at. Trying to, again, look at that crystal ball and say, okay, based on these trends, based on the forecast that we're working with, we're looking at a population increase of 17,057 up to 18,301 over the 20-year period. And so that's a number that we're given and that we work with, and that translates into, based on a number of variables, including average household size in the future, a number of housing units in the future, and then we look at, vacancy rates and how many are occupied and how many are vacant, and we establish the number of new units that we will need. What you'll see and what Jim mentioned earlier is that according to the analysis, 604 new units are needed. And one of the things you're going to see in here, which the Housing Advisory Committee had some really specific conversation about and conclusions around, is you'll notice the manufactured homes in parks. That's a number that, in my experience, is a bit unusual, but there was an interesting circumstance in Coos Bay where the, I believe it's Ocean Boulevard. I can't remember the name of the unit, the 400 unit manufactured home park that was recently approved. Became an interesting, it seems like every analysis has its sort of interesting dynamic, But this was one of the dynamics that we had to take into account and to say, okay, if 604 future units are expected, and we're looking at an increase, a focused increase in units that are more affordable in certain categories, then the 369 units in manufactured homes and parks was sort of an inevitable number that we needed to account for, because it's looking forward. It's there's a certain when we're looking in the crystal ball, we're looking for the things that are sort of most clear. And one of the things that was clear was that there's an entitlement for a certain type of development, and frankly, it meets a middle housing need. And so it was one of the things that we talked about and discussed, and actually had a couple different strategies for looking at it. And the one that made just the most objective sense was the distribution that you see here. One of the things to keep in mind, and actually let's look at this other one here. This is a reconciliation of that 480 acres with the 79 acres that are necessary to meet that demand of 604 units of those types. And one of the things that kind of stands out from this particular table is the fact that 159 buildable acres, 210 and 31 acres exist in each of these categories. And so to just really be clear about what this analysis does is it says how many acres will be needed to meet the projected need, right? And so nothing about this analysis itself in any way explicitly or deliberately limits any of the buildable land within Coos Bay from realizing development. It's a decision-making tool to try to understand. A lot of communities use the tool to figure out whether a UGB expansion is necessary or not. Because if you had a deficit, then not only you're obligated to expand your UGB. That's not the case in Coos Bay right now when it comes to housing. I also think it's really important to note that just because the buildable lands can accommodate the needed growth does not mean that the regulatory framework is adequate or is perfectly appropriate. And so one of the recommendations, let me bring this up here. So these are essentially the findings in a nutshell. The housing needs analysis is not a policy document. It's not a recommendation-rich document. It's a characterization. But there are findings included, and they're frankly as simple as, there's currently a sufficient amount of buildable land within the zoning categories to accommodate projected need, including consideration of affordability. Some of this capacity is in the form of parcels that have potential for infill and redevelopment for future multifamily units. The character of the future supply can and should be guided by housing policy and strategy recommendations that should be included in subsequent reports and ultimately integrated into updates of the City of Coos Bay's Comprehensive Plan and Development Code. That step that I described, where we go from this analysis to the Comprehensive Plan update to the Development Code, is a process that's being undertaken now. Those same advisory committee members are involved in that process of trying to translate that into something a little more distinct policy-wise. Jim mentioned some of the needs that are specific around certain types. Middle housing was one of the emphases of this whole House bill. A lot of Coos Bay Comprehensive Plan policy language resonates around housing choice and making sure that there are options that are somewhere between the apartment, multi-story apartment building and the single-family home. But that area in between provides a lot of opportunities. And frankly, sometimes when we think about affordability, or just, I like to think of it as simply, cost appropriateness, where you have individuals who could afford housing in certain categories, but can't find housing in that category. That could be middle class, middle income folks, higher income folks. It's about trying to match those up to make sure that you get a good distribution. And so that is the housing needs analysis in a nutshell. If you've thumbed through it, you've seen that there's a lot more to it, but that's sort of the high level summary that I have prepared. And don't know if Carolyn's back, but I think we'd probably both like to answer questions that you have about it. Thank you.
Questions?
Roger, I have a question. So I think recently you reported out that we have 500 new housing starts, which I think includes the manufactured park that he just made reference to. So was that included in this analysis? I'm a little confused.
I'm not sure if they are included, but what we have done, Councilor Farm and I were working on a presentation to the League of Oregon Cities, and we've counted some of what we know is in the planning stages as far as new units. It did include 11 established ones that we're aware of, and that's the ones above the buggy bank. But the other, technically, it's the ones we counted up is 491 that we're aware of. That does not include new single-family or other duplex home starts, which Public Works is in the process of getting me the ones that have come online in the last couple of years and the ones currently under permit review or under construction.
So of an inventory of, 608, you're saying that we already have 498 new starts, correct? New development, so it's a much smaller number that we're going to need by 2040, and the focus should be rentals and low-income housing. Is that correct?
I think that's a fair representation. I think it's always, and I think others will probably chime in, this is always a moving target because while this presentation was made, several houses came off the housing market, or several units. You lost 6 2 weeks ago in one fire. The other fire this past weekend was not in the city, but that was another home that was lost. I think it fluctuates, and I would tell you, I think that while this is based as per the protocol, I anticipate that your housing growth will be, your growth of your city will be a little bit better than what's happened in the past. Things are more vibrant today than they were in the past, but PSU's calculations are based partly in history.
So I guess the point I was getting to was if we only have 100, right, housing units or apartments left to fill potentially the need by 2040, shouldn't the city be focused on units that are for the lowest income category because the rental market here is so expensive and there's just not enough inventory?
I was just going to chime in. This is Jake with the Lane Council of Governments, and it's an excellent point, and it is essentially the point that those housing advisory committee meetings and quite a bit of I have worked with, just sort of anecdotally, a similar project with the city of Coburg, where they got a fairly, frankly, kind of meager population forecast, and we looked at their buildable lands, and Coburg has a lot of development pressure to sort of objectively in this area, and so it's kind of interesting how there's a chicken and egg kind of issue there. They were told, that there would be in the next 20 years a need for, say, 300 units, and they had like an 80-unit subdivision that was happening right at that time. And so it was one of the first times that I kind of went the rounds with Portland State to say, how do we reconcile this if the growth that is expected for 20 years occurs in the first, kind of before you start, in the first couple of years, how do we account for that? And they stand by their models, and they have some explanations, and they're not always terribly satisfying, I think, to a completely non-technical person, but they do iterate on those, obviously, and there will be another projection that occurs pretty soon, and they work very closely with the cities to find out what's happening, you know, and if the city can say, look, we've got these pipeline projects that are going to happen there, and we want you to account for that. It's a tricky thing to note, and that was when I said it was an interesting moment as we considered it. That's ultimately what I was talking about, was figuring out, do you just assume that those 400 units are kind of gravy and they're just going to happen and we should plan around them, or do we kind of own them and say, well, let's assume that part of that growth assumed that a 400 unit development like this was going to happen, and then ostensibly things would slow down for 19 years. You hope that that's not the case, but I think tracking those population forecasts going forward is the thing. And then also remembering that the analysis is very quantitative, and that you saw how much buildable land there is. You know, like you said, you want to focus on what are the kind of housing needs that we want to incentivize, and how can we really focus on what seems to be the need that's emerging. That's kind of the recommendation that emerged from this, was you have buildable land, focus on policies that promote the housing that you want.
Well,
Thank you.
that partially is true, not quite. Bob, you have some comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Roger if the developer of the 400 units is, if they giving you a timeline for build out, how long will it take them to do the 400 units?
Well, they would love to have it built today, but once they get their go-ahead and can move forward, they're anticipating a 7-year build-out till where it's completely full.
So there's part of your answer, is that it sounds like a lot, but it's going to take a number of years for it to happen.
Yeah, but besides the 400 units, we have, another 100 and that doesn't count the single homes that are being built, and we're going to track that. So I think we're in the right path. And the other thing about buildable lands, some of them are not available to build or will not be built. I mean, I forget how many acres are up there off Elrod that might or might not be developed. And if that individual owner doesn't want to do anything with it, I don't know what we can do about it. And so, I mean, I've had this discussion with Roger, and it puts us in a bind, because if it's not available for development, then it puts us in a spot they're really not available buildable lands, even though it's considered buildable lands. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a classic issue. Totally classic. That you have again, the Coburg example is the remaining acreage is one owner who is not budging. And so the Coburg is kind of butting heads with DLCD to figure out if this isn't really buildable, but it doesn't seem to be a legitimate constraint based on the current. So it's a very legitimate point.
I think to me, the critical issue, and the one that's most problematic, is what is the pathway to getting the lower income housing developed? Because there's no way to do it right now without a heavy subsidy. And where is that subsidy going to come from?
Well, I mean, we're moving forward. I mean, I looked at the 15,000 or 18,000. I mean, even the 9 units out in Empire are going to be real close to that cost. I mean, so, there's some things that are happening, and we're moving in the right direction. You have West Plummer that's doing another 6-plex. You got the 9-plex going in. You got some other things that are happening. So.
Well, and you have your own project that you are in essence subsidizing, and that is the cleanup of the Inglewood School.
Right.
And that is going to be deed restricted for low income, and we're just assuming it's 1.9 acres. We're assuming that could equate out to 25 apartments. I could be wrong, that could be more. But this is a interesting dynamic, an interesting conversation with lots of variables. Some of the questions still remain on the recent changes to the legislature. What are the unintended consequences of additional restrictions on landlords and owners? We're seeing now that some people are taking their long-term rental units off the market. They're either selling them or they're turning them into Airbnbs because they don't want to deal with the hassle.
Right.
So as time plays out, we're going to see what the ramifications are.
Yeah, and this report says, if I remember, if Jake stated it correctly, 7.5 vacancy. I think that's high. I mean, from my indication on some of the rent, like E.L. Edwards and some of these others, Grand Management, that doesn't seem to be the case with them.
I don't know what it is currently. 2 years ago, it was less than 1%.
Right, so 7.5 doesn't seem to compute, I guess.
And what we found at that time, and it may be the case still, that 1% or that small percentage of those available are probably not places anybody would want to really live in.
Right. So, I mean, we have an issue that we need to deal with. There's no doubt about it. So. And low-income housing is going to be one of the critical ones from what this indication is.
While this is all challenging, I think what we're seeing, though, is good, positive movement for additional housing stock. This is probably one of the best places we've been in as a city for some time.
Right. And so PSU's population determination is going to, I mean, we don't think that's accurate at this, do we?
No. And
Okay.
I think former Mayor Soji had opinions about that and had long conversations or arguments with PSU about their modeling.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Carmen, go ahead.
Do we have any idea where the discrepancy in the housing availability percentage would be coming from? Like, why would it be such a wide gap between potentially less than 1 and 7.5?
Well, I have to disclose, and we're talking about that 1%, we're talking about something that came out in the 2018 report.
Yeah.
So I truly don't know what it is right now.
Yeah.
Are you talking about vacancy rates?
Yeah.
It's still down there. Yeah,
I was just gonna say it could be less.
a lot of that 1% that you hear about is actual vacancy between when a renter moves out and the landlord takes a little bit of time to clean it up and paint it and fix a few things. So it may be vacant for a month, and that counts toward vacancy. But they've got a long list of people ready to rent it when, by the time they're ready. So I talked to all the property managers, and Joe is right, when you talk to any of them, they've got a list. They've got plenty of people to fill vacancies. We don't have that problem.
Bill's exactly right. The turnover rate is a critical issue for property management, and the units that we have out of the reservation, it's not unusual for us to run 5 to 7% vacancy rate, and sometimes it takes us 6 months to get a unit back online. So that's part of where that gap comes from.
Okay. All right.
I guess the only point I was hoping is that we could be strategic, right, going forward, knowing what we know now.
I think so.
Is trying to find buildable land for the low-income
Yep.
families, because that's where we need to focus our efforts. So
Well,
that was
yeah.
And even like Bob mentioned, it's going to take 7 years for that modular home project to be built out. So in the meantime, we still have that, it's a moving target.
Another good thing to keep in consideration is this document in context. It's a good reference for our buildable lands, what exists, what they're anticipating. But when we're looking at what needs developed, I think the 2018 study, when it looked, this document doesn't address the economic mobility or the people who are of a middle income bracket who are living in the low income housing because that's the only housing they could find, and they priced out the low income people. If we can get middle or low income housing built, middle income people will move up to more sufficient housing, low income people can move into the lower income properties.
That become available.
And
Yeah,
that
whichever one of
was
those we can
discussed in
do.
the housing committee.
One of the other problems, though, is that Airbnb thing. I just encountered that incident here over on Fifth Street, with what in the past was like an 8-unit
Yeah.
low-income housing apartment, which has now been totally converted, and it's only for temporary housing for people that are moving into town for short periods of time for professional contracts.
Huh.
Totally lost for the low income.
Yeah, I know which one you're talking about. I didn't realize that.
You know which one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I do too.
But I also think it's important to say, and as Bob alluded to it, to make it pencil out for a developer, and this is something we're going to be challenged with in the coming years, is, you know, there is a method, or, you know, however you would qualify that, to what percentage can go towards low income versus, you know, middle income homes, and how that can pencil out to make it, you know, doable for a developer to put that investment in, and that's the challenge.
Yeah, I think we saw examples of that at the League of Oregon Cities conference, right? It was a mix.
Yeah, I think, didn't we talk about, I mean, you can do variations to like 20% or something like that, but you can't have all low-income housing because it isn't going to be a workable solution, is what was determined, right? You want the balance.
Yeah, I think in that context, what was discussed, if you build up a multifamily housing complex that's rather large, you want to have a percentage, a mix in there, so that a portion of them are low income, but others are not. Right. And that everybody aspires to do better. Correct. And move out. I think the other thing that's going to be important as you look at this report was made for Coos Bay. In your 2018 housing analysis, that was a county-wide, and I don't think it was as deep a dive as this one was. Right. This is a great report. I'm really pleased with what was presented.
Really good foundation for jumping off and maybe creating some incentives down the road.
Before you move on.
Yeah.
I know it seemed like a flash in the pan when it first came out, talking about tiny housing. It's not going to go away. That is going to be part of the solution, and I know I can say that over the horizon at the reservation, we're already looking at a potential 12-unit small tiny housing project. So that's something to keep in mind.
Well, when you say the reservation, do you mean the Coquille Indian Tribes property? Okay.
And we talked about the tiny homes, but you have to have go through the planning commission, have a special unit. I mean, you can't plop a tiny home in the middle of a house.
Right. I mean, the way that we're looking at it is as a planned development.
Correct. Yeah.
You know, and that might be yet another solution to the low income thing.
Could be, yeah.
I'm not saying it will fly, but it sure needs a look at.
Absolutely. And these opportunity zones, like where the modular home and also the one out in Empire, isn't it their obligation to meet that, be in the opportunity zone and take advantage of it? It has to meet, doesn't have to be in a low income or moderate income housing?
Well, the opportunity zones are identified based on social economic factors.
Right.
So that's how they get the designation, and the hope is that if they identify those, that people that have funds that they want to take tax advantage of, that they'll reinvest that in that area and otherwise bring that area up.
Okay.
So it doesn't say how they can invest it, but it does tell them that they can invest it there, and then there's limitations on how long they have to leave their investment there. I think the minimum is 10 years.
Right. Questions for Carolyn or Jake or anyone else on staff?
I had one more. This study says that there's going to be a need for 604 new housing units, that you have an estimated vacant housing unit of 659. Is there an explanation to that?
Jake, Carolyn, question?
Yeah, so, I mean, to kind of follow up on this conversation, so 7.5% was a figure that was a census figure. And, you know, the conversation about where that, where vacancy rate should fall, the more that you, in the essentially the model that we put these numbers into and cranks out numbers, if you were to turn the vacancy rate knob down, right, you said, okay, well, let's go something like 2%, then your housing need is going to drop proportionally. So you're going to go, if you went from 7.5 to 2, you're probably going to go from 604 units down to 200 something units needed, because you're assuming the structures that are there have folks in them, and vacancy is just a very standard housing element when you're doing that analysis. And so that's the irony is not lost on me for sure, but the idea that you would have a need of 604 units and you would still have 659 units that were empty. It's just this idea that the way that housing stock and housing dynamics work is that we don't have this perfect scenario where, you know, the need is just every house in the community has somebody occupying it. And so that if you look at the existing, you know, housing vacancy, it's 577 units today is what that number assumes. And so going forward, there's a proportional to the population increase amount of vacant units. And so that one's just a math problem. And, you know, vacancy, I think, is something that in the hearing we could do a better job of sort of describing. You know, we heard quite a few numbers too, and, you know, I think the real estate profession and the vacancy numbers that tended to emerge from that were definitely very different than the census numbers. I think sometimes, like was noted, there are a number of housing units that aren't the most attractive places to live, but they still exist as units. Hopefully they get caught in that sort of redevelopment mill. And then there's also seasonal vacancy that gets wrapped into this stuff. The places that are just usually not lived in. They're not full-time residents. Anyway, that was maybe a little more elaboration on the answer than was wanted.
Rob, with that answer. Anyone else?
I just wanted to say thank you.
Absolutely.
We kind of beat up the PSU numbers, but it's still a great.
I appreciate the, Jake, thank you so much for the report. I think it's a great piece to have, so I appreciate your time. And
yeah.
So, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're absolutely welcome. Looking forward to the next steps. I think
and
sounds like the council is too.
Carolyn. Great. Okay, so the next item is proposed comprehensive plan and zone designation amendment for 2550 Woodland Drive. Is Carolyn doing this, or Jim, or who?
Well, I'll assume I'm doing it because Carolyn probably can't get through. So the owner of 2550 Woodland Drive.
Thanks, Bob. Good seeing you.
Just south of Thompson, to the south of Thompson, has requested a comprehensive plan amendment and rezoning of his property from medical park to low-density residential. So that would be both in the comprehensive plan, that's the RL, and the LDR6 zoning. The owner has had difficulty renting the property to medical personnel or to use the property for tourist-style housing as currently authorized in the medical park land use district. If the amendments are approved by council per the draft ordinance and as recommended by the Planning Commission, residential housing would not be limited to just medical staff. And this draft ordinance will be brought to you on October 6th for your consideration.
Council, questions about this or any concerns? Now, this is going to go to the Planning Commission first, right?
It's already gone.
Oh, it already has. Okay, so it'll be coming before us?
Yes, on October 6th.
So the Planning Commission has approved this, if you have any questions, you might address them now, otherwise.
So Jim, it says the north 586 square foot is an active medical office. Is it still going to be an active medical office?
I can't answer that question, but I can have an answer for you on the 6th.
Isn't it zoned in that area for that type of use?
Yes.
Okay. So they would have to change the usage.
They'd probably, they're probably grandfathered in to keep that use until such time as the use ceases.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, discussion of to initiate Grant Avenue right-of-way vacation and review of draft ordinance. Did I skip something?
No.
Okay. Jeez. Are you on this one too, Jim?
Yes,
or Randy?
sir. Yes, so the owners of 506 North Main have requested the city vacate a 60 by 110 feet portion of unimproved Grant Avenue right-of-way adjacent to their current south property line. This vacation application will be brought before the council at October 6th for consideration to initiate the vacation proceedings. And then the public hearing for this vacation would be, is proposed to come to you November 3rd. So this, as far as staff's concerned, we don't see that there's any or reasonable possibility of expanding that road because of topography.
Questions on this? No? All right. So the next one is discussion of Lindy Lane right-of-way vacation. This is that modular home area, is it not?
That's correct. We previously brought this to you and you initiated the vacation, authorized that, and so we're at a point where this will be coming to you for consideration on October 6th. And this is for the southmost 1,040 plus or minus feet of the existing Lindy Lane, completely surrounded by the applicant's property.
Mary,
Yes.
in addition to this, I think at our next meeting, we'll bring another matter before you. And there is an existing easement that was found on that property. It's in the name of the water board. Well, it's listed as the water board, but technically the easement's actually owned or recorded by the cities of Coos Bay and North Bend. The easement, I believe, was put into effect in the 50s. There are no water utilities in the easement. The water board doesn't believe they're going to need it. And so we've been requested by the developer to extinguish that easement. I think staff concurs that that's the right thing to do, and so we'll bring that to you for your consideration at your next meeting. It'll be a separate matter to this, but it is connected.
Questions or comments, concerns? None? All right. Next item is review of the Coos Bay Municipal Code, Chapter 9.35 on graffiti. Deputy Chief Chapman has handed some things out, and we have some things in our packet. And I'll be back.
Good evening. So a couple months ago, when we started to see a little bit of the uptick in graffiti around the city, we thought it would be a good idea to take a look at our current graffiti ordinance and also reach out to some other cities in Oregon and compare our ordinance to what they were using. So we started comparing and we took a look at ours, and we drafted some proposed language changes or additions to ours. I know that over the last few months I've been mentioning to you guys that I was going to try to bring something to you, and so that way we could have a discussion. We felt it was going to be best appropriate at a work session because I think it's going to lend to definitely some questions and maybe discussion. So I did hand out two handouts. I believe they're also on your, at least the proposed language is on your council packet, but it's something that you can reference and make notes to as well. The current ordinance, it starts off with definition as does the proposed ordinance, and there's really not a whole lot of changes there other than you'll see the blue underlined suggestions, and it was for like penalties. It would be for the application of graffiti. And then if you notice the very last two definitions, one is the notice and procedures for graffiti abatement. That's only going to apply or pertain if you guys choose to add that into the ordinance, and we'll discuss that a little bit later. And then the other one would be the immediate removal of hate speech graffiti, and that's again if that is decided upon, and that's the direction you guys choose. And so then we just dropped down into definitions. We really didn't change the definitions a whole lot. We added a little bit to them, but we did add abatement. We feel like there needs to be some definition describing what abatement is. It means to remove graffiti from the public view, such as by removing or covering the graffiti. Again, this is all just suggested language. And we took, I guess, it notes a little bit later in here, but I guess I'll tell you that we took a lot of this proposed language out of Canby's ordinance as well as Sherwood. And Canby is about 17,800 population city, real similar to ours. And Sherwood is about 19,500, somewhere around there. So both of those cities are fairly comparable to what we're looking at. And so we also felt like there's some reference to the chief of police in this proposed ordinance. So a definition means, chief of police means the city of Coos Bay police chief and or his or her designee. I think that's important. Then it pretty much parallels the existing ordinance that we're working off of with some additional explanation in the definitions. And one is in the graffiti area. We added, and which is visible from any public right-of-way, any other public or private property, or from any premises open to the public. That's a suggested addition. Also, if we, as we move forward in this proposed language, some of these definitions are going to make a little bit better sense. One of them is the graffiti nuisance property. If we choose to have a section in there that defines what that is or describes that, I think it needs to be in our definitions as well. Owner, we didn't change anything on that. Person, we didn't change anything. We did add person in charge of property means an agent, occupant, VC, contract purchaser, or other persons having possession or control of property or supervision of a construction project. I think that's kind of important to define who has that authority. Property is defined as any real or personal property, and that's covered in the ordinance 409. And it was amended during the 2008 codification. And then the last definition, and this is only going to be relevant if you guys decide to move towards adding a immediate removal clause and a hate speech clause in there. We'll want to come up with a definition of hate speech and put that into our definition section. Now, I will tell you that is my, at least looking into it, there's not a ORS definition of hate speech in Oregon. There is bias-based crime, and they reference what that means, but to my knowledge, there is nothing out there that would actually define that, so we might be in some uncharted waters. So,
My point out, anytime you start talking about controlling speech, you're
Yes.
running into First Amendment issues.
yes,
So,
the content of which that speech is
yeah, right, exactly.
the same.
So, and I noticed that the other two jurisdictions, I guess, don't really have that kind of definition in it.
So we couldn't find any other jurisdiction that, I'm not going to say we did a full exhaustive search, but we couldn't find any other jurisdiction that had a immediate removal clause and a hate speech clause in there. I think it's probably because it's so, you're toying so close to your First Amendment rights. The next page, 9.35.050, and that's just penalties. Basically what we added there is we just felt the penalties for what? For application of graffiti. Not a lot of changes under that section. There was some language put in there from one, and I believe it was Canby, that had a community service in lieu of or in addition to fines imposed. And City Manager Roger Craddock also made a reference there, and I agree with him on that. I think this may not be applicable for us. We don't have a muni court. We don't plan on implementing a muni court, so community service just may not be an option.
I think, in addition, we've already been advised by our insurance carrier that we're not insured to supervise community service projects. It is a liability to cities. And when they come out and say that, that means they have some history. to show that. And then you also have to insure those people when they're on community service.
So that provision would have to come out of there.
I believe it should.
How does the jail do it? Because they send out work crews.
They're already remanded to their custody.
Oh, okay.
And I'm not real sure, we didn't do a lot of research on community service. I don't know if there's a private contracted services you could use, but I just think that that may be getting way out of the scope of what we intend to do here. So if we drop down to the property defaced by graffiti as a nuisance, this came from, that first line actually came from Canby ordinance. And graffiti is allowed to remain on the property, and it's allowed to remain on the property and not promptly removed invites additional graffiti and criminal activity and constitutes a nuisance. So we're getting into basically defining why we feel it's important to have this graffiti ordinance and have a section in there that talks about the removal of the graffiti and the reasons behind that. Goes on to say any property within the city which becomes graffiti nuisance property is in violation of this chapter and subject to its remedies. So this is now moving into the graffiti nuisance property, and the owner or the person in charge of the property who permits the property to be a graffiti nuisance property is in violation of this chapter and is subject to its remedies if we grant it. So you got any property within the city and then any owner in charge of that property. Any graffiti which the owner or person in charge of the property allows to remain on his or her, or we struck that and we just put the property, or which the owner fails to promptly remove may be declared a graffiti nuisance property. This is where I think a lot of discussion is probably going to need to be had over these next few paragraphs and sections. If you choose to go that route, then I think it spells out the abatement process below, and then also there's a section in here that also gives the police chief and the city manager, they both confer together that the graffiti is, defined as potentially a hate speech, or it's offensive in nature to a point where they believe it calls for immediate removal, then that could happen as well. But again, I think we need to really define what that means. The abatement process, and I can read all through each one of these lines, but I think you guys probably have already read through them and probably have kind of some ideas or some thoughts. I'd be happy to answer anything. But basically what we're talking about on the abatement process is allowing up to 5 days. And that may be a point of discussion too. Is that too long? Is that too short? If it's not 5 days, maybe it's 3 days. And then what do you do if the person doesn't want to remove it? Do you go into that immediate removal? Do we actually enter onto people's property and remove the graffiti under the abatement penalties? Or, I know that Nate had also made some comments in here, and we may not run into a whole lot of resistance for a property owner that didn't apply the graffiti or the speech on their property. You may not have a lot of resistance for us entering onto the property and removing it. However, they're going to probably be concerned about the means and how that graffiti is removed and what the potential damage may be caused to their property. But you also have to maybe consider what's the situation going to be like if the property owners are going to place that graffiti or that speech on their own property.
So, And I would ask Nate, at what point can you sidestep due process?
I don't think you really can.
So, I mean, you know, who's gonna decide that that it's on private property, but it can be seen from a public street? Who's gonna decide that this is offensive and send city employees onto that property
Well, that's
without giving that property owner due process?
That's the problem you have with, you know, you say offensive hate speech.
Who's making that decision?
Yeah, well, I think there has to be criteria, and I think that criteria has to be applied in a manner which there's a due process, like you say. That's why this is a difficult thing to accomplish, and maybe to a certain extent somewhat impossible. I mean, as long as we have cooperation of the landowners, and so far we pretty much have, that's fine. But what happens if an owner of property says, I don't want to do anything, or hey, I agree with that, and I want to keep it here. It's his property, and it may be offensive to some, but I think to a certain extent he has a right to do that.
We actually have been in that situation in the not too distant past with a property just a block and a half from here where the owner was in I guess a domestic dispute and was scrawling different things on her property, and it would change from time to time.
Yep. So maybe what I think I'm hearing you say is there's no definition of hate speech, but can we not get around it by saying it's derogatory speech, and derogatory speech includes swastikas, derogatory comments against race, religion.
If you're going to do it, you're going to be very, very specific. But anytime you start talking about trying to regulate speech,
right,
you've got issues. I mean,
But
issues
isn't,
that I'm not so sure you can get around.
Is that a double-edged sword, though, also having it so defined?
It's better to be specifically defined than vague or overly broad. Because that's the problem with First Amendment, is that even where you can regulate it to a certain extent, I mean, you can't yell fire in a theater kind of thing. You can regulate that. But you need to be very specific, because if it's broad or overbroad, then it's generally found to be unconstitutional.
so what's the difference between that and asking them to remove just general graffiti?
There's nothing wrong with asking them to do it. The question is, will they do it?
If they decide not to do it.
And if they decide not to, what's our process? And how long do we want to give them to say, okay, you have, let's say it's not hate speech, let's just say it's just graffiti.
That may be where we need to go, just generally
that's
what
what I was
graffiti is, maybe a definition of graffiti, keeping away from the speech issue and requiring them to do it, but you still have issues there. But if you establish it as a nuisance and have a process to address the nuisance, that might be the way to go. I mean, which is incorporated, it is in here, it's just, I think, frankly, I think we need to keep away from the speech issue. I just think that's a tough one.
So we're keeping away keeping away from the speech issue, but really we're just defining two types of graffiti. Is that fair?
I'm not
Two
quite following.
types. There's like, I put Lucinda's running for city council, graffiti on a wall, or if there's a swastika or a derogatory comment, can't we define the two types of graffiti without using hate speech and still be in compliance?
You can define it, and I think if you're going to go that route, you need to define it, but you're still regulating speech, which is a problem. As long as the property owner has no problem with it, that's great, because they're going to say, I don't want it on my fence or whatever else, and I'm going to clean it off. But what if he doesn't want to do that, and he's in support of whatever that was, I think you're going to have some issues in terms of compelling him to remove it.
Even if we regulate it, right? Even if it's specified, we're gonna have
Yes,
problems.
even if you outline it specifically.
I'm inclined to suspect there has to be some other city in the country, at least, that's had to deal with this issue and has an example. We might benefit from reaching out to the National League of Cities and seeing other parts of the country have a little deeper rooted history with this. I'm sure they have solutions.
I don't know, the First Amendment's gonna be tough.
Well, also, so we currently allow, I mean, we haven't been requiring people to abate their graffiti on, say, the train, would that be, I mean, that's port property, would that fall under the city of Coos Bay? Would we be requiring that the port cleans up all of their
That's a
rail
really
cars?
good point, Carmen.
I'm only laughing because that has come up numerous times before in the police department where we have some officers that don't see any gray areas in the law and think that we could actually regulate that and make the train, or the port actually clean them up. And there are some things I think is just a fool's errand.
And that's
to go
what
after.
I'm seeing that as being like a major
Yeah.
cost for them. I mean, I realize that we're talking about it all over, but that would be constant maintenance is my guess, and might be unachievable. I mean, would they be in constant risk of a $250 fine a day? I mean, it
If we
seems like they
confine
would.
this to real property, that might solve that problem.
Yeah, 'cause I think the bigger issue is, in my personal opinion, is how far do you go saying that you can't do this with your own property? And that's where we're gonna run
I
into
don't
the
think
issue.
I don't think there's a lot of, as a property owner, I think you have a lot of discretion in terms of what you want to do with your property. I mean, you see that reading the paper, people doing what most people would say bizarre things with the property, and the community is in an uproar, and the city tries to stop it, and there's not much they can do about it.
So what happens if?
Because it's speech.
What happens if you put a time frame on all graffiti, and we define graffiti, and you put a time frame on it to have it removed, and then there's a penalty applied every day after that time frame, and regardless of what you're not trying to regulate speech that way, you're just putting a time on 3 days it must be removed, regardless of what it is. And then outside of that 3 days, there's a penalty that could be imposed, whether it's $250 a day or whatever that is.
But now you're putting the onus, and I'm not saying you can't, on the property owner to address the graffiti. We're assuming that the owner's not the one who put it on there, or is not supportive of what's on there. But I can see an owner saying, I don't really want to do this, so I'm going to say, I like it, I want to keep it. There's no simple answer. Anytime you're talking about speech, there's no simple answer.
Yeah,
I think it's a fight worth investigating, because even if
Absolutely.
it's somebody wanting to throw swastikas on their own building,
It's offensive.
yeah,
but
and it's
can you regulate it?
a good, yeah, I think it's worth investigating how, at least.
Yeah, I
Well, and to
think-
Drew's point, this is, I mean, I'm sure bigger cities have this issue, right? So, I'm, you know, a Pollyanna, Nate, there has to be something out there that addresses this issue.
I think it's worth the investment of time maybe to look and see, as Counselor Farmer
I
said.
agree there.
I agree.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then I think a lot of these things like 5 days,
We're
and then
not
I
the
think we need to
first.
be specific on what hate crime is. And then one of them in here, the chief has the opportunity to make the determination. It's kind of arbitrary, I think, right?
Yes, yes.
So, I mean, we're gonna have to tighten some of this stuff up and determine it. But I guess the first hurdle is to find out or if it's even possible to regulate. I think we need to find a way to try to do it, but how do we get there?
We'll just look in, we'll just research a few more, and we'll see what else is out there. And
I think to Drew's point, and maybe the National League of Cities might have something available, and I don't know, so how do we get there? Through Roger?
The LOC
Drew?
has, our membership in the LOC gives us free access to the National League of Cities resources.
Okay.
I'm on their website right now.
So, real
So,
quickly,
I mean, I appreciate the work here, and I think it's great. I think the intent behind this is fantastic. I mean, obviously, we've had issues with it, and so we're being proactive in trying to get there. It's how do we get there legally, you know. I mean, as Nate said, if the property owners are agreeable, I think that's wonderful. And I'm not even so much interested in the fine. I'm more interested in, you know, maybe we go out there and take care of it and give them a bill rather than fine them. I mean, that's because we're trying to resolve the graffiti. We're not trying to, you know, penalize somebody. But
Well, and we just talked about, you know, the income levels, and some people that may have it on their property may not be able to afford a penalty or removal, and they may need some assistance.
And we have in the past, and we actually currently have graffiti removal kits, and that we will provide to property owners that are victimized by graffiti, and to assist in that removal process, because you're absolutely right. Sometimes it's costly.
So, back to my question about the port and the city. Is the port property separate from city jurisdiction? Or is that all under the same?
It's still under the city, I think.
I think it's regulated, right? I mean,
Regulating rail cars might be a different animal, because that's
sure.
interstate commerce.
of course, rail is always a different animal.
Go
A
ahead.
little frustrating.
But the property, the real property itself, the port property is, yeah, that's within the city.
I see.
I don't know, it's something to look at. I think I would hope that the port would be a good neighbor and do some of this stuff and take care of it, but I don't know.
I would hope at least when it applies to some threatening speech or hate
Correct.
speech, but, just it's generally, every car has graffiti on it, and I'm wondering how that's gonna play out for them.
I think the one thing you'll hear from the port is they do not own the rail cars. Those are all leased.
Oh,
And they come
yeah,
and they go.
All they do is move them around for somebody else.
that's true.
And if this related only to things that are reported to us, I don't think many people go out and audit what's painted on the rail car.
They probably would if it was hate speech, though.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, so I'm just, running through potential scenarios in my head.
Well, and
Yeah.
you're definitely running up against art versus graffiti in those instances. Some people view graffiti as art, and some of it is.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
I mean,
Banksy.
we have a building downtown on 101 that has graffiti art on it, so, and where drawing the line is gonna be a quest. What's that?
Oh, okay.
Oh, storm drains.
What a wonderful opportunity for us to research it more.
This seems like a big task, but at least I appreciate that we're moving forward and trying to do something about it, because it does need to be addressed. So,
I think so too.
good luck,
Thank you.
and I hope you come back with an answer.
Okay, we'll certainly try.
Under summary abatement, we might also want to build out imminently endangers human life, defining whether that's like a graffiti structure that somebody built or an incitement of violence against individuals, groups or individuals.
What section are you in?
810 170, summary abatement. Chief of police, any law enforcement officer, or another city official may proceed summarily to abate a health or other nuisance which imminently endangers human life or property.
Anyone else? Thank you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's it, and back to our first work session. Yeah, well, that's great. Anyway, comments by anybody? No? All right, see everyone next Tuesday.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, 7 o'clock, you bet. Thank you, everyone.
It's been a while. It's been a while since we've done this.